Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Max Boot, who is the Olin Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York and a contributing editor to the Weekly Standard. A former writer and feature editor at the Wall Street Journal, he's the author of The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars and the Rise of American Power. He is the 2003 Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Memorial Lecturer on the Berkeley campus. Joining us in the studio is Professor Thomas Barnes, who is Professor of Law and History and Chairman of the Military Officers Committee on the Berkeley campus. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome, Max. Did the fall of the Soviet Union influence your perspective on the world?
I would say so, sure. I think the fall of the Soviet Union was a tremendously consequential event in recent history. It was a triumph for freedom, a triumph for the United States. But at the same time, it has limited value in thinking about how do you go forward. I mean, it was a great moment in our history, but of course, you have to think about fresh challenges, just as in 1945, we could celebrate the fall of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but then you have to think about fresh challenges and how do you confront the changing international environment. And that's what we've been doing ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Tell us a little about your education. Where did you get your degree? I got my degree right here at the University of California at Berkeley, which is why I'm wearing this old bear tie that I dug out of the closet.
And you notice, by the way, that with that fulsome introduction of everybody you've written for, he never mentioned the Daily Cal Thursday column.
That's how I got my start, the Daily Californian.
In journalism?
That's right.
That's right.
Writing a weekly column. I used to say that I was the second conservative in the history of the Daily Californian, but after David Brock defected back to the left, I guess that makes me the only one.
The only one. Only surviving one.
So what happened to you at Berkeley? Did it confirm your conservative inclination because the place was so far on the other side, or what?
I think to some extent that's true. I'm a natural contrarian, and it certainly played into that aspect of it. I think I've actually become somewhat less conservative in a lot of ways over the years, mainly less socially conservative. But in terms of core beliefs about liberty and foreign policy and defense and those kinds of things, I certainly was not shaken from those by my experience at Berkeley.
And what got you interested in U.S. foreign policy, national security policies, which, while not the only topics you've pursued, seem to be the one closest to your heart?
Well, it's something I've always been interested in. I mean, I grew up in the waning days of the Cold War when this was still very much of a big deal, and the idea of confrontation of the Soviet Union, the idea of possible nuclear annihilation, and the questions of how do you deal with that were very much uppermost in our minds. And I think that's a very hard thing for people who are undergraduates today to understand, to go back to the Cold War mindset. And I was probably the last generation that was still a part of that, but that was how I was raised. I remember following in the late 70s, early 80s, the debates over the neutron bomb and Pershing IIs and cruise missiles and all this kind of stuff. And that basically taught me the importance of foreign affairs. I mean, this was not something you could run away from. I think we had a moment of illusion after the end of the Cold War, this moment of false serenity after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and we could suddenly shut out the world and imagine that everything would be fine and freedom and liberty would progress inexorably around the world no matter what we did. I think that was an illusion, and an illusion that was rudely shattered in 9/11. But I've been interested in foreign affairs from the start, and I'm glad to see that the rest of the country seems to be catching up.
Mm-hmm. And for you, in delving in that subject, history is very important. You were a history major here, and what is the importance of history for someone who's interested in foreign policy and national security policy?
Well, the first importance of history is that I think it's essential for those of us with short attention spans because it tells some fascinating stories, and they're easy to follow and they make sense. Now, relating them to the present day is always a challenge, but I think it is essential. And when you think about foreign policy or politics, it's not an area where it's very easy to do controlled experiments. So the way that you really learn about what's ahead or what you can expect is by trying to make an informed sweep of history and to try to draw lessons from the past to inform the present, which is not easy to do. But I think that has a lot more value than some of the more complex constructs that political scientists come up with lots of equations and so forth to try to explain what's going on. I think a more humanistic attempt is likely to prove more fruitful.
You're preaching to the choir on that one, of course, as it works out. But, Max, let me ask you a question. You've written 2 books of great note, and I know a third is in the way. They're on quite different subjects. You gore an awful lot of ox on this, or oxen on this. And, of course, the first of those books is the out-of-order Arrogance, Corruption, Incompetence on the Bench, which is, of course, a study of the courts in this country. We'll hold it up there, exactly. The other one is The Savage Wars of Peace, which, of course, is more recent, and which is something of an underpinning for your Nimitz lectures. Now, as both a lawyer and as a historian who teaches military history, how dare you, without having a JD, without having commanded troops in battle, I haven't either on that score, but how dare you take on those 2 hallowed institutions, 2 professions, along with the clergy, which of course we don't count in this country anymore, the law and the military, and be fundamentally, at least on the lawyer's part, very, very tough. Now, you know that's a rhetorical question. You must answer it unrhetorically, however. Well,
that's very kind of you to say so. I guess this is both the benefit and the curse of being a journalist, that we're always wading into areas where we know very little, and we're trying to learn a lot. And I think it can be a weakness. It can also be a strength, because when I approach a subject like military history or the courts, I'm really coming at it from the standpoint of somebody who is not an expert, and I'm trying to learn enough to make it understandable to me, and I hope that thereby I will also make it understandable to ordinary readers.
In other words, war is too important to leave to the generals, and the law is too important to leave to the judges.
I think there's some truth to that.
A lot of truth in that.
I mean, but these are very complex subjects, and I wouldn't claim to be, especially in the legal sphere, a great expert or put my expertise up against that of law professors or judges.
You wouldn't be shocked by the fact, though, that in fact, Out of Order, the book on the courts, received an extremely favorable review, received a favorable reception among quite a few lawyers too.
I did hear from some lawyers who had their own pet peeves about judges, and were glad to see a lambasting of judges occur. But I mean, I enjoyed the legal book, but I really feel more at home in military history and foreign policy. That's always been my first love, and I'm delighted I've had a chance to return to that now full-time, working at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Tell us a little about how the book, The Savage Wars of Peace, came about. What were you looking for and didn't find, which led you to write this book? Before we talk a little about the book in a minute.
Well, in the late 1990s, I got interested in all of these lower-level American military interventions of the past decade in places like Somalia, Bosnia, Haiti, Kosovo, and so forth. And I started looking around and wondering, well, is this something new? Is this a new departure for the United States, or have we done this kind of thing before? And the more I delved into the history, the more I thought, hey, this looks pretty familiar. We were just in Haiti, and we were in Haiti in 1915. But I didn't really find a single account that kind of put it all together and gave us a history of these small wars of the United States and put them into the context of today's wars, the smaller wars that we've been fighting since the end of the Cold War. And finding that gap, I decided to go ahead and fill it. And what really drove me, the impetus for it, I think, was as much as anything the stories. I mean, I mentioned before, the real attraction of history, I think, is that it has a tremendous story to tell. And I was just blown away by the amazing stories of American military history that I was not familiar with, and I think most readers are not familiar with, about these lesser engagements that are very different from World War II or the Civil War. And so I got into telling those stories, but then at the end of those stories, I decided to relate it to what was happening today. And I didn't want to just leave it at the stories. I wanted to offer my own take from having told the stories about what it meant and what the implications are for American policy for the future.
And why do you think, in terms of historiography, why do you think the stories hadn't been told or weren't there at your fingertips when you went to the library?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it just has to do with an understandable fixation on the two big wars that we've fought, the Civil War and World War II. I mean, when you go to any bookstore or library, you see whole shelves groaning under the weight of volumes devoted to that. You see movies constantly coming out about that. And it makes sense, because those were the two most important wars we fought. They've done a tremendous amount to shape our history. And I'm not going to sit here and claim that our intervention in Haiti in 1915 was as important as World War II or the Civil War. Taken individually, none of these interventions was very important, and so most of the coverage they receive is from obscure historical monographs. But I think if you combine them and put them together, I think you see there's an important historical tradition here, and that's what I'm trying to highlight.
You made a good point in one piece, though, the one on the Siberian adventure, the one of the intervention in Russia, that had, in fact, not just the United States and its Siberian end of the things, and for that matter, of course, the troops in Murmansk, but also the Allies, the French and the British, if they had managed to really bring some force to bear, adequate enough to support the White Russian counter-revolution, that the history, of course, of the Western world might have been considerably different. Bolshevism might have been nipped in the bud.
That's a very good point. That was really one of the great lost opportunities in history. And often when American troops are sent somewhere, you hear very many warnings about the possible costs of failure, and that's appropriate. People are afraid of another Vietnam. But I think it's also important to keep in mind the cost of inaction. And in the case of Bolshevism, where people like Winston Churchill, who was a minister in the British cabinet at the time, and General Ferdinand Foch and various others, thought there was a real opportunity to strangle the Bolshevik baby in its crib, and it didn't happen, as a result of which untold horrors unfolded for Russia and the world. And I think that was truly a terrible lost opportunity, where a small war, if pursued a little bit more aggressively, could have changed the course of history.
Were there any themes or types of personalities or political configurations that tended to emerge in a lot of these stories?
The causes of the interventions are very broad and varied. It's very hard to generalize about them. One thing that emerged, which I found really fascinating, was just the character of the fighting men of the United States who went off on these smaller expeditions. It was just very hard for us to understand this kind of mindset, where you would have a handful of Marines or sailors on a distant station, unable to communicate with the United States. Communication could take months. They were really on their own. They couldn't call in air support. They couldn't call in any support. They had to do what they did, and they did it magnificently and often displayed the most breathtaking feats of heroism and courage. I mean, that was really what I think fueled my interest in the book, was just to read about these deeds, which don't get the recognition that they deserve, and all these amazing lost heroes of American military history, people like Smedley Butler, great Marine, or Frederick Funston, great Army officer, or Stephen Decatur, great sailor of the early Republic, who are heroes of these small wars.
And when we got involved in these places, I guess what comes out in your work is that what we then set about doing is very different from the kind of shibboleths that had developed in the 90s about not intervening, about not getting bogged down, about, well, the military is supposed to have only a military mission and not do social work and so on.
That's right. If you look at the history, we have violated pretty much every tenet of the Powell Doctrine. This notion promulgated by Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that basically we should only fight big wars, and we should only do wars with overwhelming force if we're going to win a total victory, and then leave immediately. And that has seldom been the way we have fought wars. If you look at the historical pattern, we violated all of that. American troops have often been used as quote-unquote social workers. American troops have often stayed in theaters abroad indefinitely. They were deployed in China pretty much continuously from the 1840s to the 1940s, roughly 100 years, with no exit strategy in sight. And those kinds of examples you can multiply many times, that all these things that people assume are the natural order of things are in fact a myth. And if you look at the history, it clearly shows that it's just not the case. That's not the way it's been.
But what is the fundamental ethos of the American military? You know, this is something, teaching military history, I keep coming back to time and time again. There's something different about the American military, and you suggest that it's not what everybody writing history books on the basis of stuff found at the Carlisle Barracks would agree is the essence of American military history. I think you've more than got a point. I think you provide a corrective that's been sorely needed. So where would you draw? What larger lesson as to the nature of this ethos would you draw? What are we? How should we? Not so much how should we fight wars, but what best suits us in the form of fighting wars?
Well, it's a very tough question. I think one of the things that strikes me reading the history is just how wide the variety of missions the American military has undertaken have been. Everything from fighting major wars to escorting school children in Arkansas during the time of desegregation. The armed forces basically wind up doing whatever it is the president needs them to do. And I think it's a very narrow view that says they should only be used for fighting major wars. Very often our interests make it necessary for them to do much more than that, especially in pursuit of these dread activities of nation building, which everybody shudders with horror to think about, but in fact is absolutely necessary in order to convert battlefield success into long-term political success. And the military since day one has been involved in quote-unquote nation-building activities, and often very successfully, but that history tends to get overlooked.
Did you read Carl Bilder's book, The Masks of War?
No.
No, he suggests that each of the services, he doesn't deal with the Marines, has its own self-image. For the Air Force, they're boys with toys. For the Navy, it's the senior service, run silent, run deep. For the Army, well, it's whatever anybody else wants you to do, whether you have the stuff to do it with or not. So the ethos may perhaps have to be, to some extent, determined by particularly the forces involved. Yeah. And of course, in the savage wars of peace, an awful lot of the weight of what was being done was carried by the U.S. Marine Corps.
That's right. I mean, one of the interesting things I found is that although all the services were deeply involved in small war missions, I mean, especially the Marines, but also to some extent the Army, you know, their primary job was at fighting Indians up until 1890. The Navy was certainly involved in gunboat diplomacy, especially in the Caribbean. But although this was a mainstay of all the services, all of them resisted it because they all wanted the greater glory of big war missions. And although the Army kept fighting Indians, they never came up with a doctrine of Indian fighting. Their doctrine was always geared towards big European land wars. And the Marines were masters of this imperial constabulary duties, and yet they didn't want to do it either. They came up with amphibious warfare between the wars as being their new mission. So the kind of resistance that we see today within the military to these small war missions is a tradition in and of itself. Even though they've always done it, there's always been a resentment of it.
But the Marines actually had a manual which you came upon, and tell us about that manual, a guide for small wars.
Well, this was the Small Wars Manual, which the Marines wrote between the wars based on their experiences in places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. Basically, a how-to guide for dealing with insurgencies, with guerrillas. How do you run counter-guerrilla warfare? And the Marines did it very successfully. They set down some of these lessons, but then the book, the Small Wars Manual, had the misfortune to be published in 1940. And of course, a year after that, small wars seemed passé. We were certainly in the biggest war in our history. And that was very much the mindset which came to dominate the military post-World War II. And I have a chapter in there on Vietnam in which I basically argue that, unfortunately, a lot of the lessons taught by the Small Wars Manual were neglected by the military in Vietnam. They tried to fight Vietnam as a big war, and I think that was responsible for part of the tragic outcome of our intervention.
Please go ahead.
I was just going to say, couldn't we have learned something from the British experience in Malaya and the French experience, in fact, in French Indochina? It's always amazed me the degree to which both those nations and powers dealt not with complete successes, especially in the case of France. I mean, you know, 1954, Dien Bien Phu, May 1954. It's really, in a way, the end of it. But both of them did know how to fight these small wars. We don't seem to have learned an awful lot from them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly other countries had a proud tradition of fighting these small wars and using counter-guerrilla tactics, and as I try to show, so did we. We had the same tradition, but unfortunately it gets neglected. And I think part of it was an institutional rivalry in Vietnam because the Marines really had had this institutional knowledge, and they tried to implement it, but the war was not being run by the Marines. It was being run by General William Westmoreland and the Army High Command, and their view was, oh, you know, what is all this nonsense the Marines want to do? We know how to do this war. We're going to put massive firepower down on our targets because that's the way we did it in World War II in Korea. That's the American way of war. And unfortunately, it didn't turn out to be the best way to fight this kind of struggle. And if we had looked a little bit at the history and at the experiences of other people who had fought these kinds of foes, I think we would have come up with a better approach.
Now, your chapter on Vietnam, in a way, is a pivotal chapter, and you've just described what the problem was there. But what came out of that was a doctrine called the Powell Doctrine. Let's talk a little about that, because in a way, that doctrine and the perception of Vietnam that was associated with that doctrine really influences all that follows up until the present. And in a way, one could say that the 90s were, you know, defined by that doctrine in terms of the way we thought about the military and how we would use it. So remind us now what the Powell Doctrine said, and give us an indication of what really was wrong with that.
Well, a whole generation of officers who went through the agony of Vietnam were deeply scarred by it, and understandably so. It was a horrible experience, not only because they lost so many of their brothers on the battlefield, but also because of the institutional damage it did to the military. And they came out of Vietnam saying, never again. We're never going to repeat this kind of fiasco. They didn't come out of it saying, we're going to figure out a better way to fight next time. They just wanted to eschew these kinds of messy, low-level interventions altogether, and that's the essence of the Powell Doctrine, saying we're not going to fight these low-level wars ever again. If we ever use force, it's going to be massive, overwhelming. We're going to win instantly and then go home via an exit strategy. That's the essence of the Powell Doctrine, and that was, I think, the essence of the post-Vietnam mindset epitomized by General Colin Powell, who was the outstanding officer of that generation. Unfortunately, as we found in the 1990s, that kind of mindset is not a very good fit with the actual missions that the American military is called upon to undertake in places like Somalia or Bosnia or Haiti or Kosovo, places like that, or more recently Afghanistan. You can't just win a massive, overwhelming victory and go home, because if you do, the fruits of victory will crumble before your eyes. So you all have to have a longer-term intervention if you're going to create a stable political order. And we've been doing that since the early days of the Republic, but it's very much outside the ethos of the Powell Doctrine. And so what I suggest is that history repudiates a lot of these tenets about how to employ American military force. And
one of the consequences, really, of the Powell Doctrine and this perception of what the Vietnam War was about was the notion if you go in, not only do you go in and get out quickly, but you have to have total American support. But more importantly, it was a loss if you lost one American life. So there was a high premium on a war in which no American lives were lost.
That's right. And in the 1990s, the government tried very hard to create these casualty-free interventions. And of course, you don't want casualties. That's a horrible thing. You want to protect your troops as much as possible. But at the same time, if you set up ground rules under which no casualties will occur, it's very hard to achieve a mission, the mission that you're sent over there to do. The best way to protect your troops is to keep them in Texas. If you're going to be sending them to places that are inherently dangerous, like the Balkans or Haiti or Afghanistan or whatever, there's going to be a certain amount of risk involved. And I think the men and women who are sent over there understand that risk and they're willing to take it because they know that's what it takes to accomplish the mission. But if you have these incredibly restrictive force protection guidelines, in effect, it makes it very hard for those troops to achieve the mission. And it actually has a demoralizing effect on the military because they're being told, well, we're sending you over here, but it's not very important. The job you're doing isn't very important because we don't want you to risk anything in order to achieve success. And that's not the message you want to send to the troops. And certainly soldiers I've talked to don't like those incredibly restrictive guidelines that are in part a product of this Vietnam mindset, which is that we have to avoid casualties at all costs because if we suffer a single loss, political support will crumble and we won't be able to sustain this deployment.
Can we now? Are we prepared?
I think we are. I think the American people are much more realistic about this than some of the policymakers in Washington. If you look at the survey data, they are much more accepting of casualties and know that you can't have a completely risk-free military intervention. And in fact, if you look at our recent experience in Afghanistan, we didn't suffer huge casualties. It was a couple dozen, but didn't have any perceptible effect one way or the other on the level of public support for the war. I think if the public is convinced that the war is important, they're willing to take risks in order to get the job done. I think part of the problem in the 1990s was that the government had a hard time explaining the importance of some of these missions and therefore wasn't able to muster support and tried to do them with the least cost possible in order not to have to muster that support. But I think when you're dealing with situations like Afghanistan or Iraq, where people can see a more immediate danger to the United States, I think it's much easier to get public support even if there are real risks involved.
In looking at the history of these small wars in earlier eras, was public opinion important? And if it was, what really made the difference? Is it that they didn't have pollsters then, or was it that we had leadership, that could bring the issues to the public, and that somehow was aborted in this period after the Vietnam War?
I think the importance of public opinion can be exaggerated, especially when you're dealing with these smaller expeditions involving volunteer soldiers and sailors and Marines. getting public support is vital if you're going to send draftees, because you're taking young men and women unwillingly from their homes and sending them somewhere to fight. And it's very hard to sustain an unpopular war, as we found out in the later stages of Vietnam, if you don't have full public support. But in many of these smaller wars that I write about in Savage Wars of Peace, there wasn't a huge amount of public support. In fact, there was often quite a bit of opposition, particularly notable in the case of the Philippine War from 1899 to 1902, when a who's who of prominent Americans, from Andrew Carnegie to Mark Twain, mobilized as part of the Anti-Imperialist League against the war. But there was also a substantial amount of public disagreement with deployments in Haiti and Dominican Republic and Nicaragua and Russia, as Professor Barnes mentioned earlier, and so forth. So you can't expect public unanimity. In fact, the only war we've ever had close to unanimity behind was World War II. Every other war has pretty much had some degree of public opposition, but as I try to show in my book, a small number of professional soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines were still able to get the job done, even if they didn't have complete 100% backing at home. So I think it's possible to exaggerate the importance of public support.
How about collateral damage? How about, in other words, the loss of civilians on the other side specifically?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we've become much more wary of that than we used to be. I mean, it's amazing when you read the accounts of World War II, the firebombing of Japan in 1945, when even before the atomic bombing, when we killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, just incinerated. Yeah. And nowadays, if you have one stray bomb that hits a wedding in Afghanistan, this is an international crisis. I think partly this is a result of developing technology, which changes standards and expectations, because in World War II, the bombing technology was very imprecise, and you were lucky if you hit within a few miles of your target. Everybody knew you were going to have massive civilian casualties no matter how hard you tried to avoid it. Now, with the revolution in precision-guided munitions we've seen in the past 20 years, everybody knows that you can pretty well put a bomb very close to its target within a few meters of where you're aiming it at, which creates tremendous expectations that you will always hit only the bad guys, and you will leave the mosque next door perfectly alone.
And the Chinese embassy.
And the Chinese embassy. And generally, I think we do a pretty good job of that. But, you know, this is a very hard activity. You can't be 100% right all the time. You make human errors, you make intelligence errors, all sorts of bombs can go astray no matter how good your technology is. So I think that we have set the bar unreasonably high at this point, but it certainly should be higher than it has been in the past, and I think the American military has become pretty good about collateral damage. This has become much more of an issue than it was 50 years ago.
And you point out that in this era in which the Powell Doctrine held sway, that the concern for the loss of American life was so great that, in fact, the primary mission became not the mission itself, but actually the protecting of the American troops who were being deployed for the mission.
Right. This crazy ethos where troops who were being sent to Bosnia were told force protection is job one, which made them wonder, well, what the heck are we doing here? Force protection is job one. Why are we being sent to a war zone? That
yeah,
that seems inherently risky.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I hope that we've overcome some of that. You know, it's funny because in places like Bosnia or other war zones, our allies have been much more gung-ho in many ways, including the British and the French, both of whom are much more liable to send their troops to patrol in shirt sleeves and without having a platoon at their back, but just to send a couple of men to wander through a marketplace and do that kind of policing, whereas the American military ethos is we're going to hunker down in Camp Bondsteel or some other fortified facility. We're only going to send troops out in a reinforced platoon with armored Humvees and wearing the full battle rattle and all that.
And the Bradley are too.
And the Bradley and all that kind of stuff. And that just makes it very hard to interact with the civilian population. It makes it very hard to do your job, which is to build up trust and to create a stable and secure environment. You're not doing that if you give the impression of being scared yourself.
Before we talk about the consequences of 9/11, which really changed things, you are a part of what we might call a cohort, a younger generation of thinkers and theorists who essentially laid the groundwork in their writings for the present administration to seize the initiative after 9/11. And I would like for you to help us understand what you see as the common themes that emerge from that cohort, and that this cohort was writing about during a very different era, when, during the Clinton era, when in fact we were at the high point of the implementation of the philosophical assumptions of the Powell Doctrine. Tell us about this group. I mean, where was the beehive of intellectual activity? Where did you do your writing? Was it in writing, in journals? What? Give us a sense of that.
Well, first, Harry, let me say that I appreciate your calling us a cohort instead of a cabal, which is what some people call us.
Well, at least I can do it. Berkeley.
That's right-wing conspiracy.
That's right. That's right.
That's right. Nowadays, you often read about the vast neocon conspiracy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And for a conspiracy, I think it's the most poorly disguised conspiracy of all time, because all of its work has been in the public domain,
right.
And especially associated with the Weekly Standard, a magazine that I'm now proud to be associated with as well. But a lot of the folks who have been clustered around that circle were warning after the fall of the Berlin Wall that this was not a strategic pause. This was not a moment where we would have a holiday from history. That a lot of folks were warning about the great dangers that lay ahead, and that the only way to avoid those dangers was for America to take a real leadership role in the world, as we did post-1945. We could not retreat from the world as we did in 1919. We had to be actively engaged, because if we retreated, we would suffer a terrible price. And I think that in a lot of ways, 9/11 showed the kind of price that we would suffer if we were not actively engaged, even in distant lands like Afghanistan. So a lot of people were warning about this kind of thing going on during the 1990s. Two friends of mine, Donald and Frederick Hagan, wrote a prescient book in 2000 called While America Sleeps, warning about these dangers ahead, and it didn't get the attention it deserved, because we were still not wise to the threat that we faced. And as I say, I think 9/11 made people wake up and realize, hey, maybe these guys were onto something. Maybe there really is a danger out there. And I think it has alerted people to some of the things that people in this cohort or cabal were saying all along.
And was it the self-confidence that came with the fall of the Soviet Union, the sense that the battle really wasn't over? Obviously, the Soviets and communism were defeated, but the challenges would never cease. I mean, how important was that?
I think there was a lot of that. You saw a real splintering on the right after the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, a lot of these divisions had been papered over, but then after the Cold War, the question is, what should be the foreign policy now? And you had a lot of different camps emerged. You had the libertarians, who were basically isolationists. You had the old-fashioned right-wing isolationists like Pat Buchanan, who were back to the days of Father Coughlin and the America First Committee.
Exactly.
All these trends that had disappeared on December 7th, 1941 came back with a vengeance after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
1991.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. Right. It all came back. But there was a small group on the right that was arguing, no, our mission is not done. Just because communism collapsed doesn't mean that the world is now safe for democracy. There are still dangers out there, and the world can go to hell in a handbasket pretty fast if we don't take a leadership role. Mm-hmm. I think that was probably a minority view within the Republican Party for most of the 1990s. In fact, it may have been a minority view within the Bush administration up until 9/11. But I think those attacks changed things very fundamentally, in much the way that December 7th, 1941 changed everything. And in much the same way, I think both December 7th and 9/11 both woke people up to the dangers and made them realize isolationism is not an option. We have to be engaged, because if we're not, we're going to suffer terrible consequences.
As a kind of an intellectual process, I'm curious as to get a sense from you of kind of the intellectual excitement for the people who were kind of doing this kind of writing at that time. I mean, you were still out in the woods, so to speak. I mean, the country hadn't really embraced it. What was that Playlight? I mean, how did you generate ideas among each other and actually kind of elevate your common consciousness of the dilemmas that we were in?
Well, I think there was, like with any other group of like-minded people who are engaged in the same pursuit, there is a fair amount of give and take and interaction. As I say, a lot of it in this case centered around the weekly standard, but it's like anybody else. I mean, if you have a group of experts on Mayan pottery, they're going to exchange ideas on Mayan pottery and send emails to each other. And when an article on Mayan pottery appears in the New York Times, they'll email it around. And we had pretty much the same phenomenon here dealing with these security issues. There aren't that many people who engage with these issues from this perspective, and we're not all very tight-knit by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there's some back and forth. Now some of the people who are engaged in that in the 1990s hold some senior positions in the administration, so they're able to articulate these views within the administration while some of us are articulating them from the outside.
Do you think that our forces now are configured to fight the kind of engagements that are now required, where I guess in your terms you would say that the American empire has to do its business and meet its responsibilities?
The thin green line on the edge of empire, protecting our interests while America sleeps. I think our forces are pretty darn good, not only the best in the world today, but obviously the most powerful in world history. That said, I mean, I think there are some areas of possible improvement. I think we're stretched very thin right now, and we'll be stretched especially thin with that task of occupying Iraq, which is going to tie down probably 2 or 3 Army divisions. I think the Marines, for example, need to step into the breach and get more involved in some of these nation-building activities that they've tried to get away from in the last 50 years. I also think we probably need a somewhat larger force, and also need to spend somewhat more on the military, because we took a procurement holiday in the 1990s, and our forces are out there with antiquated equipment in many cases. But all that said, I think we do have the most tremendously capable military in history, and they've done a tremendous job. They've shown that they can meet any challenge that they confront, and I think Afghanistan was a particularly dramatic example of that, because if you'll think back to September and early October of 2001, if you listen to what the pundits were saying, all the talk was about quagmires, another Vietnam. This will be like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, the dreaded Afghan winter, and all that kind of stuff. And I think in retrospect, it's obvious the Afghan winter was a lot like the winter in Key West. It wasn't that dreaded, but more importantly, the American military showed they were capable of fighting in a tremendously challenging environment and prevailing, despite what all the weight of pundit opinion was. And I think that's in general the case, that if you let our forces use their initiative, if you set these young 20-year-old junior officers and NCOs free to do what they can do, they will achieve amazing results. The only thing that can hold them back is wrong-headed directions from their commanders or from Washington.
The day is the 11th of March, 2003. It's worth noting because this is a historical program. Before very many days have gone by, there is a very real likelihood that the United States troops will be in fact committed in Iraq. Is it going to be in fact the mother of all battles? Not from Saddam's perspective, but from ours. Is it in fact going to be the quintessential infantry battle of mobility? Is it going to be, in fact, much less reliant upon big blue 82s, 20,000 tons of stuff going into the ground, set the dial, you can get down to 55 feet, a little less, of course, 45 feet, a little less of all the high-tech targetry things that you were discussing a moment ago, and fundamentally we'll get down to essentially platoon, company, and at most perhaps battalion level type operations in conceivably an urban environment.
Well, first, let me note that this is a dirty trick, asking me to prognosticate about what happens.
No. I'm just
for people who are going to view it after the fact.
All right. I will. Sorry, Max.
No. I will.
We will edit out.
Oh no, you won't. Oh no, you won't.
If I say anything bad, I hope that turns out to be incorrect. That winds up on the cutting room floor.
I'm not so much asking for prognostication, but as it's sizing up.
Yeah.
As you see what's preparations.
Look, it's obviously impossible to predict ahead of time exactly what shape the battle will take. I am confident that our forces will be victorious in relatively short order, and I think for basically 2 reasons. One is our overwhelming technological advantage, which has only grown since the 1991 Gulf War, and the second is our tremendous manpower and if you like, person power advantage, which is that we have these superbly trained troops
Yes.
who are much more motivated, much more trained, and much more battle ready than anything the Iraqis can throw against them. And I think the combination of that will lead to overwhelming victory.
I have a question for you. We've talked about the forces, and we've talked about this group who thought about these problems in a period when it wasn't easy to talk about. Another key element comes in, which is our commitment to the notion of the American ideal and how it can change the world, Wilsonianism in short. And I'm curious about your sense of the importance of that tradition as a resource both for our soldiers, for our leaders, and for resonating with the American people with regard to that mission.
I think that's a tremendously important point to bring up, and that is, in some ways, the most potent weapon in our arsenal is the promise of freedom that American troops bring with them. And that is the reason why when American troops enter Paris, or they enter Pristina, or they enter Kabul, or shortly Baghdad, they are greeted as liberators, not as oppressors, because the people know that we do not come to establish an empire, we come to give them freedom. And that is a tremendously potent tool that we can use to the fullest, and I think we should use to the fullest. And any foreign policy that doesn't take advantage of that is not being truly, quote-unquote, realistic, because there's a school of realpolitik foreign policy which eschews idealism and wants to concentrate on hard power. But I think that is very short-sighted, because some of our most potent power is the power of our ideals. And I think that the most successful foreign policy presidents are those who can combine high ideals with an understanding of the power politics needed to implement them. And I'm thinking specifically of presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Ronald Reagan, and I think George Bush is showing himself to be part of that tradition.
One of your predecessors as Nimitz lecturer was Joe Nye, and he was particularly interested in getting across the importance of soft power. The real question that I'd put to you is, how soft can the soft power get before it ceases to be power at all? I don't think there's a calculus, an exact one, but you
can exaggerate the impact of soft power. Tom Friedman had this famous McDonald's theory of conflict prevention, which is that, according to him, no two nations with a McDonald's ever go to war with one another, which sounded great until 1999 when the U.S. and Serbia went to war. And you know what? They both had McDonald's. So there's limits to how much you can expect from Madonna and McDonald's and all this other American, quote-unquote, soft power spreading around the world. That's ultimately not going to be the ultimate guarantor of our national interest and security. I mean, people who think it is are falling prey to the same illusion that was prevalent before World War I, when so many people thought that the growing interdependence of the world made war an impossibility. And clearly, if history shows anything, it shows that's not the case. I think we have to back up our soft power with hard power, and we need a lot of that hard power. And I think the reason why the soft power works, the reason why peaceful commerce takes place, the reason why we can have this interchange with the world, is basically because America serves as the global policeman, that we are guaranteeing and underwriting the security of this world order. And it's the same way that normal commerce functions in any city in the world, in the United States. I mean, how does Berkeley or New York or any other city function? You don't have to have omnipresent police power, but you have to have the threat of force in the background to make sure that peaceful people are not going to be set upon by predators, that the rules will be obeyed, and people will follow the law. And you need to have some kind of force that guarantees that happens. And in the international sphere, very often, there's really no alternative to the United States as being that guarantor.
So I'm sorry.
No, please.
So we're going to be Rudy Giuliani in New York.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
How much of the small crime do we have to deal with in order to get rid of the big crime? In other words, what are we, out there in this world, how about the guys who are cleaning your windshields and you don't want to be doing it?
Yeah.
Are you going to go after those guys? To what extent?
I'm not sure we need to worry about turnstile jumpers in Baghdad.
Okay, all right, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I know what you
have to worry about the stadium in Baghdad. Yeah.
No, I mean, obviously you have to choose your moments and pick your targets, and we don't have the resources to literally police the entire world the way that the NYPD polices New York, but I think we certainly have to focus on the more egregious cases. And we've seen some of them in the past decade in places like Bosnia or Kosovo or Afghanistan or Iraq or Rwanda, or I wish we'd done more to stop the slaughter. I think those are the kind of cases where there is an overwhelming case for American intervention, whereas, you know, there's going to be petty wrongdoing or oppression going on in many countries that we just don't have the resources to address.
Mm-hmm. Now, was it getting back to this Wilsonian motif, was it this younger cohort of neoconservatives who revived that and brought it to center stage in the current Bush administration?
Oh, maybe. I mean, I think the Wilsonian strand has always been very strong in American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. I mean, people don't often think of him this way, but I really think that Ronald Reagan was one of our great Wilsonian presidents. Absolutely. He championed these ideals, and he talked about tear down that wall mm-hmm. and champion human rights in the Soviet Union, did all these kinds of things, which turned out to be very powerful weapons in bringing down our adversaries in the Soviet Union. I think that strain was absent largely from the first Bush administration, much to their detriment. They were much more worried about stability. They didn't want to finish Saddam Hussein. They were afraid about the Soviet Union breaking up. I think in retrospect, historians will judge much of that to be misguided and mistaken and leaving us with a fairly high bill to pay for the cleanup a decade later. Bill Clinton was fairly Wilsonian, but I don't think he was very adept at deploying the power necessary to champion these American ideals. I think George Bush has struggled with this a little bit. He came into office very wary of nation building and some of these other constructs which offend kind of a realpolitik conception of foreign policy. But I think since 9/11 he's changed his views, and that was the pivotal event that led him to see that we have to be more aggressive about exporting our ideals, because we cannot live with the status quo in the Middle East, especially. The status quo in the Middle East is killing us, literally, and we have to change it before another 9/11 occurs.
I'm going to play a devil's advocate here and ask you, does our commitment to this idealism put us outside of history and the rules of power? One thinks of things like power corrupts. You know, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Is there a concern in your mind that the idealism will confuse us about what our power can accomplish? Or is it the case that our idealism will free us, that is, our commitment to these values is a secret resource that will free us from the rules of power that theorists have talked about throughout, you know, Western civilization?
I don't think it'll free us from the rules of power. We have to be very wary of the limits of power and use our power wisely, but at the same time I do think that our idealism is a powerful force not only for good but for American interest. And people talk about the dangers of imperial overstretch and getting overcommitted and all that kind of stuff, and that's legitimate to think about that. But I think we also need to think very hard about the dangers of undercommitment and not being strong enough to defend our interests. I think in the 1920s and 1930s, we saw a good example of what happens when there is no global policeman, when Britain essentially abdicated its pre-World War I role of serving as the benevolent hegemon of the international system, and America did not choose to enter the void. The result was that the whole world spun into chaos and tyranny and war, and we paid a huge, huge price for that on December 7th, 1941. I think it's very important that we not fall prey to that same isolationist temptation in the post-Cold War order, that we stay actively engaged, because I think the consequences of undercommitment are far worse than of overcommitment.
Now, what about this problem of prioritizing? Let's assume that the Iraqi business goes well. Who is the next candidate, basically? Will that candidate force themselves on us by their actions, say in Iran, you know, moving rapidly to acquire a nuclear capability, or in North Korea even pushing itself to the top of the list because of its actions while we're engaged there? What is the process in a democracy for picking where you go next?
Well, I hope that we don't have to go anywhere next. I hope that people will see the success of Iraq and suddenly be converted to goodness and light and all things sweet, and decide not to challenge us in the future. Now, assuming that probably won't happen, we will have to think about future challenges, and I don't know where they lie, although you mentioned two obvious candidates and the other members of the axis of evil. Just because we're defending American interests doesn't mean that we have to do it militarily. In Iran, for example, there's a huge student uprising that's going on. There's a lot of protest against the mullahs. I think there's a good shot that before long the theocratic government might actually be toppled from within, which would be a tremendously encouraging achievement, like the Velvet Revolution of Eastern Europe. But if that doesn't happen, if we have to use military force, if our interests are threatened, and certainly the North Korean situation seems very threatening at this time, it'll go through the normal democratic process, just like every other use of force has gone through, whether it was the recent Iraq, the new Iraq expedition, or the original Gulf War. The president makes a decision. If there's time and the circumstances are right, he'll ask for Congress's approval, and it'll go through the normal political process. I mean, we're not Zaire. The president can't just suddenly go and attack somebody out of the blue for no good reason. There has to be a large level of support within the American public before we use force, and I think that's always the case when we do use force.
Does it go through the UN next time?
I don't think it has to. Certainly, if you look at the past record, very few of our interventions under presidents, Republican or Democratic, have gone through the UN. Bill Clinton didn't go to the UN for Bosnia or Kosovo or Iraq in '98.
Or Haiti.
And I don't think we're obligated to do so in the future. Certainly, I think it's just a joke to say that no use of military power is legitimate without the support of the UN, because then you would have to say that pretty much every use of military power by any country since 1945 has been illegitimate. But a law that's not enforced is not in effect anymore.
But this has suddenly become a trite and even conventional argument that, we can't. The Canadians, we can't go without UN sanction. It's not enough to have a coalition of the willing, no matter how big it is.
Let me put it this way. If we were still waiting for UN sanction, the killing would still be going on in the Balkans, Bosnia and Kosovo. There would still be ethnic cleansing there today if we were waiting for the UN to act.
But there wasn't the same outcry as there is now afoot. That was not as conventional. This is not, It was not as conventional then as it is now.
Right. I think this is just a matter of political expediency, because the strongest lobby for the UN in the United States tends to be in the Democratic Party, and they're not going to protest too loudly when a Democratic president is stiffing the UN. But, oh my God, if a Republican does it, there will be hell to pay. So I think the only rule that we can deduce from here is that only Republican presidents are required to seek UN approval for their military interventions.
I have a question for you. The neoconservative agenda and its success in American politics is associated with a revival of a recognition of the importance of spiritual values, of religion, and finding the appropriate place for it. Now, interestingly enough, what we're confronting in this new world of terrorism is religion that has been hijacked by terrorists, basically. And so the interesting question that comes to mind is the present environment different from the history that you were covering, in the sense that those cases were often isolatable from the rest of the world, whereas as we begin these probes and conflicts in the Islamic world, there is a kind of transnational identification. I'm not saying that Islam is the enemy, but I am raising the question that Islam can be used by nefarious terrorists to provoke a kind of opposition to what we're doing, random incidents of violence, even, God forbid, getting a hold of weapons of mass destruction, that put what our new agenda is in an entirely different light, much more complicated than what we did in this earlier period of our history.
I don't think that's the case. I think it would be a mistake to see us as waging war on 1 billion Muslims around the world, because we're not. I think we're waging war on a very small band of Islamist fanatics who have hijacked aspects of Islamic ideology and combined it with this fascist and communist weird melange of ideas to produce this hate-filled ideology that people like Osama bin Laden espouse. But I don't think that's the mainstream of the Muslim world. And in fact, the challenge we face today is a good deal less than the challenge we faced confronting Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, much more powerful countries. I mean, people forget that up until a decade ago, we faced the prospect of nuclear annihilation, of having every major American city be incinerated by Soviet ICBMs. Now that's an existential threat. The problems we face today are severe, but they don't rise nearly to that level. Even if they get their hands on some weapons of mass destruction, it's not the same thing as facing an all-out Soviet strike. So I think we have to put our current problems in perspective, and they are very severe, and I don't want to make light of them, but we've overcome greater challenges in our history, and so I'm confident that we can overcome this challenge. And in particular, I think that it's a mistake to think that if we take strong action against the terrorists and the Islamist fanatics, that this will cause an uprising in the Arab street and will turn the whole Muslim world against us. I don't think that's what history shows. If you look at the past decade, Al-Qaeda rose to prominence in the 1990s when America was pursuing a policy of trying to placate the Muslim street. We were pursuing the Arab-Israeli peace process. We were not striking back very hard at terrorists. We were allowing Afghanistan to become a training ground for terrorists and not invading it. We were doing our best not to incur their wrath, and it only earned us their contempt. In their writings, Osama bin Laden talks about America as a paper tiger, that we're toothless. You kill a few Americans, you can chase them out of your country. He has contempt for us. He thinks that he defeated the great empire of the Soviet Union, and we're an easy case by comparison. We're next. If he can knock off the Soviets, he can certainly knock us off. So I think we paid a very high price on 9/11, and since then, for allowing this contempt of the United States to exist. Whereas when we took strong action in Afghanistan, there was no uprising in the Arab street. It was only on 9/11 when America was struck down that there was rejoicing and literally dancing in the Arab streets. So I think it's very important we not look like a victim, and I think if we look strong and if we look like we're going to be victorious, I think there are going to be a lot fewer people who are willing to take up arms against us.
Will some of the conservative regimes in the Middle East beside Iraq have to be on the watch list if they don't be parties to this transformation of the Middle East by the democratic ideal?
Well, as President Bush said, you're either with us or you're against us. I think those are words to live by. I think it's words that the Saudis should keep in mind in particular, because I think they've played a double game for several decades now. On the one hand, professing great friendship to the United States, and in some ways really helping us out on some things, but at the same time opening up their checkbooks and writing checks to the most hate-filled madrasas around the world, and also to people like Osama bin Laden, who of course is a Saudi himself. They've been playing this double game where they've been trying to have it both ways, and I think before long they have to choose sides and decide, are they with us or against us? And they'd better know if they're against us, there is going to be a severe penalty to pay for that.
In the European case, would you apply something of the same lessons?
Yes, I would start bombing the Eiffel Tower tomorrow if the French don't get...
Careful about that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well,
I want to record it. That's a joke.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's for the record.
We'll put a sign. We have one final question, and I want to bring this question back to the personal element. Do you think your background as somebody whose parents emigrated from the Soviet Union was very sensitive to that system and our achievements in winning the victory against communism sensitized you in your work as a writer, an author, to the potential of American power and the American ideal?
I think that's actually an astute observation, Harry. I think it's when you see the protests against the Iraq War, for example, I think the tenor of them is basically that these protesters think that George Bush is a bigger war criminal than Saddam Hussein. They think America is a greater danger to world peace than Iraq. To my mind, that's a crazy worldview and at odds with history. I think if you look at history, America has been the greatest force for good in the world for the past century. We have vanquished two of the worst tyrannies in world history, in Nazism and communism. And of course, as you mentioned, I'm especially sensitive to the role that America played in vanquishing communism. So I think you have to give us tremendous credit. We have not always been flawless. We have often made mistakes. Any great power does. Sometimes we do terrible things. But overall, I think our record is exemplary. And if you put it up against that of any other great power in history, I think we will come out looking pretty darn impressive. And I think that's a point of view that doesn't get heard enough. in some sophisticated circles, but I'm proud to espouse it.
Max, on that note, I want to thank you very much for coming back to Berkeley to be the Nimitz Lecturer and appearing on our program. Thank you very much. And
Thanks, Max.
And Professor Barnes, thank you for joining us. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.